In hola, buenas tardes, good morning or good evening. Um, it's great to be here with Professor Michael Heinrich from Berlin. Michael Heinrich is one of the most renowned specialists on the work of Karl Marx and the leading author of the influential interpretive approach known as New Reading of Marx, Neue Marx-Lektüre, and his books include The Wissenschaft vom Wert, as well as two works translated into English, an introduction to the three volumes of Karl Marx's Capital, and How to Read Marx's Capital Commentary and Explanations of the Beginning Chapters. He's currently reading also a four-volume historical intellectual biography of Marx. And with this presentation, I give the floor to Professor Heinrich, so whenever you wish.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm sorry, I have a no, it is not solved. Something with now I think I got it there. Uh, Computer connections sometimes produce problems, but now I think everything is okay, and that you can hear me and understand me.
Yeah, perfectly.
Today I announced, according to the invitation, a lecture on value, capital, and crisis. This sounds rather general, but I don't want to give a general introduction. I suppose that most of you don't need such an elementary introduction, but that you already discussed Marx Capital. And so I will try to show the consequences of a monetary understanding of value theory, a monetary, the monetary character of value. What are the consequences for the theory of value, for the theory of capital, and also at the end for the theory of crisis? So I will start with a rather general remark about the object of Marx Capital. Of maybe it's not necessary in this circle here, but usually it's a question: why do we read Marx Capital after more than 150 years? And for this, it is important to bring us into our mind what is the object of Marx Capital. It is neither English capitalism, nor it is a certain period of capitalist development. Both possibilities Marx already excluded in the preface to the first volume, where he told us, on the one hand, that his examples come from England, but these are only illustrations for his theoretical development. And on the other hand, also in the preface, Marx told us that he's not interested in presenting a higher or lower period of capitalist development, but presenting the laws, the economic laws behind this development. I think this is an important remark, especially when we are confronted with conceptions of phases of capitalist development, from a competitive phase to a monopolistic or state monopolistic phase. And it is said Marx presents us competitive capitalism. At least this was not the self-understanding of Marx, that he would present only a certain period of capitalist development in Capital. What he wanted to present, I think, is very clearly expressed at the end of the manuscript for volume 3. There Marx looks back on his argumentation in the 3 volumes, and he concludes that he tried to present the ideal average of the capitalist mode of production. Ideal average, what means something to present all that what necessarily belongs to the capitalist mode of production, not what is until now developed, but what necessarily belongs to the capitalist mode of production, no matter how much it is developed. And insofar Marx succeeded with this project, I think Capital is still relevant today. However, talking about Capital, we also have to take into account another point. Marx gives us a very specific presentation of his theoretical development. He doesn't provide us just with another political economy, which is at the side of Smith, Ricardo, or maybe modern approaches to political economy. We have to take seriously the subtitle of Capital, Critique of Political Economy. And this critique means not only that certain economists or certain economic approaches are criticized. Such a kind of critique we can find, of course, in Capital, but it is just normal for any scientific approach. When Marx speaks of critique of political economy, he means critique of a whole science. What does this mean? How you can do a critique of a whole science? You do it when you critique the basic notions and assumptions of this science, when you critique what is usually taken for granted in this science. And when you do this, then we can say it is a kind of a scientific revolution, what is done there. This term became prominent in 20th century, in the 60s and 70s, with discussions about Kuhn, Feierabend, and others. But Marx himself also uses this term in a letter to his friend Louis Kugelmann in order to describe his own project as the attempt of an scientific revolution. So we will see what this means for the understanding of value, capital, and crisis. But the first critique Marx formulates, we already can also find in the preface of volume 1. There he makes a very short remark that he doesn't want to criticize the capitalists and landowners personally, because the persons in Capital are dealt as personifications of economic interests. I think this is an important remark, because it already shows a big difference with classical and also neoclassical economics. Both schools start with the individual, and they try to start with the rationality of the individual, and from this rationality they try to explain economic institutions like exchange, capital, and so on. By this starting point with rationality of the individual, it seems very natural that capitalism is an outcome of rationality. And when capitalism is rational, then there is no need to criticize it basically. Maybe you can improve here and there, but not to criticize basically. Marx chooses another way. He doesn't start with persons, but with economic structures. And his thesis, more implicit than explicit in Capital, is that the structures, the economic structures, impose a certain rationality on persons, and to these persons, this rationality looks like a kind of natural rationality to which they have to follow. When we have this in mind, then we can read a little bit more accurately the first 3 chapters in volume 1 of Capital. Chapter 1, with the title Commodity, deals with exchange relations of commodities, not of the commodity owners. The commodity owners are not considered in chapter 1. The exchange relations of commodities are considered, and we receive as not the only, but one of the results, the money form as a necessary value form. Chapter 2, exchange process, for the first time deals with the commodity owners. It is announced already in the first sentence where Marx wrote the commodities cannot go to the market by themselves, therefore we have to look for their owners. What now is considered is the exchange process between commodity owners. The exchange relation of commodities, what was the object of chapter 1, is just a part of this exchange process between persons. And one of the results of chapter 2 is that we get real money as the non-conscious, the not intended result of the actions of commodity owners. So chapter 1, the money form as a special value form. Chapter 2 gives us the real money. Chapter 3, commodity circulation. Here we consider the intersections of the exchange processes between commodity owners. These exchange processes are not isolated, they are interconnected by the use of money. The money you get in one exchange process, you need in the next exchange process to buy. You are seller in one process, buyer in the other process. And only in this process of commodity circulation, Marx discusses the functions of money with which mainstream textbooks usually start the presentation of money. For Marx, these functions of money is a result where you need the money form, the real money, and then the so-called form determinations, Formbestimmungen of the process of circulation. Because the commodity owners appear only in chapter 2, it becomes clear that the commodity owners don't follow a kind of internal rationality. They follow the rationality imposed by the exchange relation. The exchange relation gives us the necessity of a special money form, and the commodity owners who try to do the exchange process they need to follow this money form and to produce by their action real money. And this process continues in commodity circulation. So what Marx announced in the preface about persons as personifications of economic categories and interests, he is really doing in the first 3 chapters. And in so far already the structure of these 3 chapters imply a basic critique of the mainstream economics, at least of classical and neoclassical economics. So after all these more or less introducing remarks, I want to come to value in the first chapters of Capital. Marx's value theory is very often reduced to a labor theory of value. Labor spent in production creates value. Exchange is only seen in this view as an ex post realization of value. Production provides us with value, and the exchange process decides how much of this produced value we can get. I want to criticize this usual view of value, the exchange process and the production process. But before I start presenting a somehow different story, I think it is worth to note that although the existence of the production process is presupposed in the first 3 chapters of Capital, the production process is nowhere in these 3 chapters an object of consideration or investigation. The production process becomes such an object of investigation only in section 3 of Capital, titled as Production of Absolute Surplus Value. So, production is presupposed but not examined in the first 3 chapters. What is Marx doing in these first 3 chapters? I already gave a hint in my in this short abbreviation of the 3 chapters I just presented. I can condensate this, and I would say the main message of these first 3 chapters is a critique of classical labor theory of value. It is not just Marx's own labor theory of value. By the way, he never used this term, labor theory of value. Marx only spoke about value theory. It is a critique of classical labor theory of value. However, for a long time, this critical aspect of Marx's value theory was ignored, because shortly after Marx published the first volume of Capital, the so-called marginalist revolution started, and it began a big struggle in economics about the question, what is relevant for the determination of value? Is it utility, or is it labor cost, production cost? And in this conflict, Marx was put on the same level with classical political economists. Yes, this is the labor school of value, and the new modern school is the utility school. And from this utility school, or from these marginalists in 20th century, the so-called neoclassical theory started. And of course, they also put Marx in the pot of classical political economy. And also most defenders of Marx didn't do a big difference between Marx and the classics, because they had um, a common enemy, the utility theories. But I stress again, Marx value theory is mainly a theory criticizing classical labor theory of value. And without taking this into account, I think we would really misunderstand Marx value theory. Marx critique starts already with the first sentence of chapter 1, or with the first paragraph of chapter 1. While Adam Smith speaks about wealth of nations without regarding different social forms of wealth, Marx makes already clear in the first sentence that he is dealing with a special form of wealth, with the commodity form. And he introduces on the following page a crucial distinction between material content, use value when we regard the commodity, and the social form of this material content. It is value, and only value makes a product to a commodity. Commodity is not at all something natural or something what we can find in any society. And this distinction between the material content and the social form is crucial also for the rest of Marx Capital. Again and again, he comes back to this point, and again and again, he accuses the classical political economy to confuse these two sides. And this is a confusion not only relying to some details, it is a fundamental conclusion, because it is clear that a social form you can change. The material content, when we regard commodities, the material content is use value. Use values you need in every society, in every economy. The special social form value you don't need in every society. But by confusing what is trans-historical and what belongs to a specific historical society, everything becomes trans-historical. You can see this very easily with Adam Smith. He discusses the question, what is the distinction between humans and animals? And he gives as the main distinction that humans are able to exchange. Animals, they can fight about something, but they cannot exchange. But when exchange is the distinctive attribute of humans, then commodity exchange is the human behavior as such. And every idea to abolish commodity exchange must be crazy. Insofar, the confusion of material content and social form has an enormous political impact. It is not a kind of nerdy scientific detail. discussion. It is really an important political point. Now, I want, oh God, I see the time is running. I want to make clear some critical points, some points Marx is criticizing when he presents value theory as a critique of classical labor theory of value. The first point of critique is his famous double character. But double character of what? Maybe a lot of people would now answer double character of labor, but Marx nowhere speaks of the double character of labor. He speaks of the double character of labor represented in commodities, not embodied in commodities. This is the old wrong translation. Labor represented in commodities. The argument Marx uses, at least at the beginning, is rather simple. Marx argues the commodities have a double character as use value and value objects, or value, they have a value objectivity. And when the commodity has a double character, then also the labor which produces this commodity must have a double character. And Marx calls the two sides as concrete labor, producing use values, and abstract labor, which is connected with value. Insofar, it seems a kind of detailed critique of Adam Smith. Okay, Adam Smith just speaks of labor producing the commodity, labor producing value. Marx makes the distinction: concrete labor brings us use value, abstract labor brings us value. However, when we look a little bit more to the details, it is not so easy. It is a little bit more complicated. And I also have here to criticize some approaches which believe that abstract labor is spent in production, and in production we already have use values. We already have not only use values, but also value. However, when we check how Marx introduces abstract labor at the beginning of chapter 1, already in the first subsection of chapter 1, we can see that Marx nowhere speaks of spending abstract labor, and that abstract labor is connected to the exchange relation of commodities. It is on the first 2-3 pages of chapter 1 where Marx already considers the exchange relation between commodities, and he states that in this exchange relation we abstract from the use value of the two exchanged commodities. And then he continues and he argues that when we abstract from the use values, then automatically, necessarily, we also abstract from the useful character of labor. Labor is reduced to abstract labor. This means abstract labor by Marx is introduced by considering the exchange relation of commodities, not by considering a production process. And what Marx tells us very briefly at the beginning of chapter 1, he says a little bit more extensively in the section on fetishism, the last subsection of chapter 1. There Marx writes, only in exchange the products of labor receive a value objectivity, or in the new translation of Paul Reiter, a value Objektud, in German Wertgegenständlichkeit. And only then the privately spent labor receives a double social character. Only in exchange, the sentence starts, only in exchange we have this double social character. And Marx continues, the equality of the different kinds of labor can only be an abstraction of their differences, a reduction to their common character. Again, he is not talking about production, he is talking about what happens in exchange. In the French edition of Capital and in the manuscript Ergänzungen und Veränderungen, it is an important manuscript where Marx collects changes from the first edition to the second edition of Capital. There Marx includes at this place the sentence, and this reduction, the reduction to their common character, and this reduction of the different kinds of concrete private labor to this abstract thing, equal human labor, happens only by exchange, which really equals the products of different kinds of labor. So I stress this point not only because there are many discussions where can we determine value and abstract labor, is it production, is it exchange, is it production and exchange? And I intervened in these discussions, but also because it has consequences. I will come to these consequences later, but first I want to mention two more qualifications Marx made in criticizing the classical labor theory of value. Marx argues that decisive for the value magnitude is not the individual labor time a producer spent, but the socially necessary labor time. And he explains a little bit what is meant with socially necessary labor time. I don't want to repeat this. And furthermore, Marx distinguishes between simple labor and complicated labor. Complicated labor results in a higher magnitude of value than simple labor. But both processes, socially necessary labor time and the reduction of complicated labor to simple labor, are processes which don't happen already in production. We can learn about this only in the exchange process. Only then we get the knowledge what is really socially necessary labor time. It is not necessarily the same than yesterday. And what is the reduction factor from complicated labor to simple labor. So also these qualifications rely on the exchange process and not only on the production process. Now I come to the next point in value theory, the necessity of a value form. For classical and neoclassical theory, the money expression of value is just a formality. And in theoretical considerations, they even abstract from this expression. However, Marx, in subsection 3 of chapter 1, tries to establish that when value exists only as a relation, then value needs an independent value expression. Value cannot exist without value expression, and the generality of value, that the commodities as value can relate to the whole world of commodities, this generality needs the general form of value. And when this general form of value, or when the general equivalent is connected to a single bearer like gold or silver, then the general equivalent becomes the money commodity. It is a very abbreviated way in which I relate to this point, but maybe it became clear, at least when you already read this third subchapter, that Marx tries to present the money form as a necessary and not only an accidentally expression of value. This argument continues in chapter 3, in the first subsection of chapter 3, when Marx discusses money as measure of value. And there he makes the distinction that labor time is the immanent measure of value, and money the necessary form of appearance of this immanent measure. We must not study Hegel's logic in order to understand that we can catch an essence only in its form of appearance. When labor time is only the immanent measure and money the necessary form of appearance of this immanent measure, then this means we cannot get a measure of value in a different form from money. Money is our only real, visible measure of value. And insofar, there is a very strong connection between value and money, a connection which is missed as well in classical as in neoclassical economy. And therefore, Marx didn't do this, but we can call his theory a monetary theory of value. In the time which is left for me, I will try to give some consequences of this monetary theory of value. I will not talk about fetishism, impersonal power, and so on. Very important points, and also very critical points against classical political economy. I will restrict myself to this monetary aspects, monetary theory of value. But I have heard that Søren Mau will also visit your seminar, and he wrote an excellent study on mute compulsion. So I hope he will tell you a lot about these point, fetishism, impersonal power, which I omit. So I will come now to capital. And again, I will restrict to the consequences of monetary theory of value for a theory of capital. Usually, capital, the notion capital, not the book of Marx, capital It is said it is neither money nor commodity, but value which executes a process of valorization. Value leads to more value. What is the secret of this valorization process? The existence of a special commodity, the commodity labor power. This commodity is paid with its value, which is equal to the reproduction costs of the worker's family. But when the working day is long enough, then the worker will produce a new value which is bigger than these reproduction costs which are paid to him. And the difference is the surplus value which is appropriated by the capitalist. This story, I would say, is an oversimplification of the fourth chapter of Capital, an oversimplification which can even be misleading. Very often it is even connected with a kind of moralistic critique, which is taken from the notion of exploitation, a notion which Marx doesn't use already in chapter 4. It comes later very casually, and for Marx it plays a much less important role than for a lot of Marxists who lived after him. But this question, do we find a moralistic critique or is it not a moralistic critique? Also, this I want to omit here. I want to show that this story about capital and surplus value is a little bit too simple. But first, we have to remember what I said at the beginning, that Marx doesn't start with persons, he starts with structures. And insofar, also the chapter on capital doesn't start with the capitalist, it starts with the general formula of capital. Money is exchanged against commodity, commodity is exchanged against more money. Marx is analyzing this general formula of capital. He follows its inner logic. He shows that there is not a measure for the process. There is not a kind of natural measure. When do we have enough surplus value? And that it's also an endless measure. There is no kind of natural end. In commodity circulation, you have a kind of natural end. I do commodity circulation in order to fulfill my needs. And when my needs are fulfilled, I don't want to buy more food or dresses and so on. But such a kind of, in quotation marks, natural end we don't find in the capital formula, because the difference between money at the beginning, money at the end is just a quantitative difference, not a qualitative, and for this we have neither a measure nor an end. Only after Marx did this analyzing, this analysis, he comes to the notion of the capitalist. And who is capitalist? Not necessarily the owner of money or the owner of capital. Capitalist is the person who makes the objective content of the valorization process, this process without measure and without end, to his or her subjective aim. To be a capitalist, this is very important for a number of discussions. It is not necessary that you are an owner. It is necessary that you follow this objective logic of capital, and this can also be done by a manager or an employed person. For the this general formula of capital, one point, Marx mentioned this only very briefly, but I think it is important. Marx stresses that for this point of valorization, value is the overarching subject, das übergreifende Subjekt. However, and this overarching subject takes the form of commodity, takes the form of money, jumping here and there. Nevertheless, the form of commodity is the form of money is much more important for this overarching subject than the form of commodity. Why? Only in the form of the money, this subject called value can rely to itself. For example, it can measure the success of the valorization process. Insofar, the valorization process is mainly a monetary process. It needs commodity, it needs production, no question. But you cannot abstract from money when you discuss the valorization process. However, exactly this happens as well in classical theory, as well in neoclassical economic theory, while Marx stresses the centrality of money. This fits also to another point I want to stress here, the relation of production and circulation for capital. Very often, exploitation, the production of surplus value, is seen as a fact of the production process. However, Marx in chapter 4 stresses something else. In the subsection 2 of chapter 4, or in English editions of Capital, it is chapter 5, Marx presents different explanations of the capitalist gain, explanations from which he can prove that they are not sufficient. At the end, Marx concludes with a kind of paradox. Capital, valorizing value, cannot emerge from circulation, but capital also cannot emerge not from circulation. It cannot emerge from circulation, and it cannot not emerge from circulation. The solution is rather simple, but often neglected. Capital emerges from a joint process of circulation and non-circulation, and the non-circulation is production. We cannot reduce value to production, and also we cannot reduce surplus value to production. We have to consider the joint process, and Marx really is doing this. After Capital, Volume 1, the production process of Capital, follows Volume 2, the circulation process of Capital, and only then follows the total process of Capital, Volume 3. However, Volume 1 appeared almost 30 years before Volume 3, and most people who claim, yes, I read Marx Capital, mean they read Volume 1 of Capital and not all 3 volumes. So this analysis of the production process in Volume 1 dominates and dominated in the past the reception of capital. It seemed to many people that everything what is important we can find already in this first volume. And there we have a non-monetary analysis of the production process, and this was seen as the essential point. And okay, volume 2, a discussion of some special problems. Volume 3, maybe some interesting aspects, especially regarding crisis and the profit rate fall, but that's it. And this picture from the 3 volumes of Capital, in my view, is totally wrong. You have to see in the 3 volumes of Capital a permanent joint analysis of production and circulation, of course, with different main points, but you cannot tear in parts what is joined there. Now I think I should speak 40 minutes. I spoke, I think, almost 50. I hope you are patient enough to give me at least 5 minutes to talk a little bit crisis and the consequences of this monetary approach for crisis theory. Already in chapter 3 of volume 1, Marx speaks about crisis. With barter, with the direct exchange of one product against another product, we don't have crisis. Here indeed, the so-called Say's law, named after Jean-Baptiste Say, the famous French economist, this Say's law really holds that each demand, each offer, now I miss the English term for Angebot.
Each supply.
Sorry, yes, thank you very much. Each supply creates an equal demand. This is Say's law. Marx admits that this holds for simple barter, but not for an exchange which is mediated by money. Because when I sell something and receive money, nobody can force me to take this money and buy something. So the connection between selling and buying can be interrupted. And this, Marx argues, is the most general possibility of crisis. He adds that to become a real crisis, we need a lot more. We must also do more investigations, but the general possibility of crisis is given with an exchange mediated by money. And already this point is a big difference, not to Keynes, but to the classical and the neoclassical school. However, all these 3 bourgeois economic schools, they agree to the point that either a market economy is basically crisis-free. This is the idea as well of the classical school as well of neoclassical school, or this is the idea of Keynes. The market economy can produce unemployment, but with the correct economic policy, we can prevent this. And insofar, even when we have crisis, but we can prevent crisis. Marx tries to show that this is basically wrong. Capitalism produces necessarily crises. You cannot prevent them. Crises are not an exception. Crisis is not a kind of accident you can avoid. They are necessarily outcomes of a capitalist economy. And furthermore, capitalism needs crisis. Only in crisis, the blockades, the obstacles for the next process of accumulation can be removed. To show this, it is clear from Grundrisse to theories of surplus value to the third volume of Capital that Marx tries to show this. However, here we come to the limits of Marx Capital. It is an unfinished work, unfinished not only in the quantitative sense that Marx didn't manage to write down all the chapters. No, it is also unfinished in a qualitative sense, that some essential points, for example, a finished crisis theory, is missing. In Capital, and also in the texts are on the way to Capital, like Grundrisse or theories of surplus value, we can find some approaches to crisis theory, rather different approaches to crisis theory, but not a finished crisis theory. And a lack of all these approaches is that there is not a real strong connection between crisis theory and the theories of interest-bearing capital and credit. Marx probably discovered the necessity of such a strong approach only during the 1870s, at least in his letters. He is discussing this point several times. But all the writings we are reading, Grundrisse, they are from the year 57. Theories, the second volume of Theories of Surplus Value is from the year 62. The manuscript of the third volume is from the year 65. All this was before. Before. In this manuscript of volume 3, Marx has a section on interest-bearing capital and credit. However, this is the most incomplete section in volume 3. And the whole crisis theory in volume 3 is not touching interest-bearing capital and credit. However, in chapter 15 of volume 3, we can find a rather promising approach. There are several approaches, but one approach, I think, which is the most promising, is that Marx argues with a contradiction between the production process, the capitalist production process, and the capitalist process of circulation. That the production process is driven by the search for bigger and bigger profits. This means to produce more and to reduce the costs. On the level of circulation, this brings certain limitations. The reduction of cost on one side is always the reduction of demand on another side. When I have less energy costs, this means I have less demand for energy. So we have a contradiction between an infinite extension of production, but a limitation of demand. Marx doesn't discuss this contradiction between production and circulation in relation to the credit system, but we can consider this analysis, which we find on a few pages, also very briefly, in chapter 15. We can connect this with a theory of interest-bearing capital and credit. However, this is another shortcoming of Marx Capital. We have to dismiss the theory of a money commodity. Marx, in volume 1, presented the money commodity as not to avoid under capitalist conditions. In volume 3, he recognizes the limitations of the money commodity. It's an enormous limitation for the credit system and for capitalist accumulation. But he believes that the capitalist system cannot overcome this obstacle. However, in 20th century, we have the empirical proof that capitalism can overcome this obstacle of the money commodity. The contemporary money systems are not bound back to a money commodity, and this has consequences for the theory of credit and the interest-bearing capital. Insofar, I see a clear road to build a crisis theory using the approach, or one of the approaches of chapter 15, and a reworked section on credit and banks. But Marx himself didn't manage to do this, but okay, he showed a rather promising road to this, and I think with this we can live. So now I think I spoke around 1 hour, more than I should do, and I will stop here, and I'm happy when we have now a discussion, and I can answer to your questions. So thank you very much for your attention until now.
Thank you very much for this excellent talk. I'm sure there are many interesting points we can discuss now. So if you want to ask or to comment something, so please use the function with the hand. Yes, Gino.
Yeah, thanks. What I was wondering about is something that I think you maybe didn't stop too much on right now, but I did read that you wrote about it, and it's the way in which we have to deal now with the fact that volume 2 and 3 of Das Kapital are kind of incomplete and have kind of been tangled with by Engels, not necessarily in a mean-spirited way, but there is some interference there that kind of then alter the conclusions that we can come to when reading Capital then. So I guess my question, and it's maybe too general a question, would be how to navigate with that, how to approach to Capital as a whole unified enterprise, while also acknowledging that it's an incomplete work and we have to be very careful when reading through, well, Engels' editing of the work.
Shall I answer to every question at once, or shall
Yeah.
we collect some
Yeah.
answers?
That's the question. Do you want to answer first to this question, or do you want to collect 2 or 3
It
first?
depends how many questions we have, because when I start to answer, it becomes long.
Okay, now we have 2 more questions. Perhaps
Okay,
it's
then
better if we collect these 2 more
collect.
than to answer to
Yeah.
all 3. Okay, perfect. Jose Martinez, please.
Hi. I have a question. I interested in Marxism to understand our societies. And now I think in Spain, in Germany, in USA, there are alliance, coalition between working class and capitalist against the women, against the minorities. Um, I think perhaps this strange coalition is in a Marxist logic. Why? Because the earning for typical man working class from 60s, 70s now is heterogeneous, very a lot of kind of people. 50 years ago, only the working class and the people who work, men from the nationality, from the country. Now there are different people working with different earnings from this kind of men. And I'm not sure if this new populist take this new situation from the broken working class to create a new populist subjects in politics.
Thank you. And now I have one more question for this first group. Edgardo, please.
Listen me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It's about the issue of it's a methodological question about the relationship between the Hegel's science of logic and Marx's critique of political economy. What is your view? The logic works for Marx function as critical presentation or have any other status for him? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Maybe there is another question. Let's take also this. Alexandra, and then I will start.
We can take this one and then, okay, perfect.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Michael Heinrich for his wonderful presentation. And I would like to, if you could just talk about the intrinsic rationality of the bourgeois society according to the classical political economy. You tackled this topic in the beginning of the presentation. It was very interesting, but I couldn't quite understand how it appears as rational due to the economic structure and how Marx analyzes and criticizes it. If you could just explain this one more time, I would thank you very much. That's the question.
Thank you.
Okay. The questions are very different. I hope to find some similar questions so that I can give one answer to two questions, but you don't give me a chance to this. So let's start with the last question, the intrinsic rationality. The point is rather simple. Adam Smith and modern economists, they believe we have isolated individuals. They try to increase their utility by their own production. They can choose. Do they want to produce themselves or do they want to exchange? And everything what they are doing is according to this principle of maximization of utility. And from this, all the economic institutions get a certain rationality. They are not arbitrary. They are not inventions. They follow this utility maximization. So this intrinsic rationality we can see in Adam Smith's work, we can see in David Ricardo. And when we leave the inner circle of political economy, we can also see this inner logic when we study the work of Max Weber, who provided us with the bourgeois theory of society. And he explicitly also speaks about this rationality. And okay, it was also the spirit of the 19th century to provide the bourgeois society as the rational, the enlightened society. Marx criticizes this, especially in his theory of fetishism. He tries to show that this bourgeois society has its own rationalities, its own fetishism, which makes it impossible to come to a rational control of its own process of economic production, and that therefore we need basically a completely different system. Okay, I hope this will help you a little bit. Okay, the question before was according Hegel's logic and Marx capital. This is an issue which was discussed very often in the last 100 years, especially in the 1960s and 70s. For example, in Germany, it was discussed which part of Hegel's logic Marx took as a kind of methodological reference when formulating capital. I am rather skeptical, at least to such ideas that Marx took a method from Hegel and applied this method in Capital. Hegel's philosophy is not structured so easily that you can just take out a method, you leave the content behind, you take a method, then this method is turned upside down. Instead of an idealistic dialectics, you have materialistic dialectics, and this materialistic dialectics produces a lot of splendid results. Such ideas have nothing to do, I think, neither with Hegel nor with Marx. Marx learned a lot from Hegel, but not in this simple way. He learned on the methodological level how to pose problems, how to deal with systems of relations where each relation presupposes the other. When we talk about commodity, okay, the commodities are produced by capital, so we need capital. But when we talk about capital, we come to capital only with the help of commodity and money. So in this circle of categories, we cannot find a kind of natural beginning, an elementary beginning. The problem of the beginning is already a scientific problem. And with such problems, Hegel discussed these problems on a very high level, and Marx learned from this discussion. He didn't copy something, but he learned from this discussion. However, the relation Marx and Hegel, I think, is much more than just these methodological questions connected with the presentation in Capital. I'm writing a multi-volume biography of Marx, and in each volume, the relation Marx-Hegel will be treated. It is not something which you can discuss one time and then the problem is solved. No, in the lifetime of Marx, there were several receptions of Hegel, and there were different critiques of Hegel. And you cannot just put all this together. So the question is very simple. What is the relation between Marx and Hegel? But the answer is extremely complicated. And for a full answer, I think you have to wait until my biography, I hope, is completed and it will appear. So now to the first question with the infinite capital and Engels' intervention. I wrote a lot about the differences between Marx's original manuscript, especially of volume 3, and Engels' edition of this manuscript. There are a lot of changes. Nearly no sentence of the original manuscript found its way to Engels' edition without a change. Nearly every sentence is changed. The changes are very often very small, but sometimes they are not so small. And sometimes Engels reordered the material, he erased, he inserted paragraphs without making this clear to the reader with his initials. Sometimes he did, but in many cases he didn't do this. Insofar, I would say, when you want to discuss scientifically volume 3 and also volume 2 of Capital, you have to go back to Engels, to Marx' original manuscripts. However, when you do this, you will find a lot of fragmentary investigations. Engels did a rather good job to put together these fragments. He wanted to make Capital more readable, that the reader can use it, but at some points he imposed certain interpretations, which is not clear for the reader. Therefore, you have to go back to the manuscripts. Nevertheless, the manuscripts are full of problems. I cannot tell you a clear way what to do. It is a lot of research, and then you must use your own mind and draw your own conclusions, what you can do with all the material. I tried to sketch in my talk what I think is a good way, for example, to deal with crisis theory, but other persons will come to other conclusions. Now the last question about working class, coalitions with capital, neopopulism, and so on. Okay, this is a question politically very important. However, it's a little bit distant to the talk I provided. No matter, I will say something to it. First, you mentioned several countries, Spain, US, Germany, that there is a coalition between working class and capitalists. I would stress mainly the differences. In Germany, we have, in this field, I would say, a completely different situation compared with the US. You have different legal situations, you have different strengths of trade unions, You have also different traditions of struggles. So I would stress the differences instead of the common points. A common point I would see in something else, that in all the developed capitalist countries in the last 20, 30 years, you have a rise of extreme right-wing parties. I would say even in some cases, we can speak of a new fascism, new fascist parties, which are which find resonance in parts of the working class and in parts of petit bourgeoisie. I think we don't have, mainly, at least in Germany and also in France, perhaps, the situation that big capital is supporting these right-wing or these fascist parties, like it was in the 1920s in Germany, for example. Especially in Germany, of course, you have some capitalists which are just reactionary, which support parties like this Alternative für Deutschland, but in a broad range, German capital is against these parties, and this is rather clear. A lot of German capital is internationally oriented. They need workers from abroad. They want to sell abroad, and nationalistic policy is not at all in the interest of capital. And insofar, sometimes you have very unusual coalitions against these new right-wing movements and fascist parties. And I think when the aim is really to fight against fascism, there is no other chance. It's especially in Germany, in some other European countries, I think the situation is rather dangerous. I'm not very optimistic what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and in so far, I think we have to accept every real coalition, every real alliance against this threat from the far right side we can get when it is a real coalition. For example, in Germany, there are also tendencies in the Christ Democratic Party to say, okay, let's try with these new right parties. They are not so awful. We can control them, and so on. With such persons or tendencies, I don't want to have a coalition. But you also have a lot of conservatives who are really who really see the danger of the political system and of the society. Insofar, I cannot give a general answer to your question about these coalitions. I wouldn't also call all of them neo-populistic. I think we have to distinguish and to analyze very different cases and then come also to very different judgments.
Thank you. We have time for more questions. You just have to raise your hands. Okay, Fabian, one. We collect perhaps 2 or 3. Fabian.
Okay.
Jorge, wait, please. Jorge and myself, I want to ask something as well. Okay, Fabian.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your presentation. And I remember that in one of your articles, if I'm not mistaken, you point out that Marx intended to completely revise the first volume of Capital in light of his new doubts and observations during 1970s, especially about the crisis, his crisis observations, no? From this, one could infer that an analysis of the state, given the role of the central banks during the crisis, as well as of the world market, had become increasingly necessary. And just as we can now revisit and reconsider several of Marx's claims about crisis, do you think there is equally relevant material for an analysis of the state in his writings in Capital or even in earlier texts?
Thank you. And Jorge Quispe, please. Do you want to read your question or should I read it for you? Okay, I read it. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Read it, yeah, because it doesn't show me the chat.
Okay, there it goes. You mentioned that the first three chapters of Capital don't analyze production, but aren't the categories of concrete and abstract labor in chapter 1 and metabolism in chapter 3 categories of production. Furthermore, in the Heft M, Marx exposes how every moment of the process of social life is subordinated to production, even exchange and circulation. In Capital, Marx refers explicitly to exchange value as Erscheinungsform. That's it, appearance. Isn't the production the essential moment of the exposition of capital? That's the question. And here comes my own question. Okay, when you describe these parts of Marx in your talk and also in the text, for example, how wealth appears in different social forms, or how people become owners only within specific systems, or how private property depends on certain social relations, I think you're giving a very clear picture of the structural side of Marx's argument. But it made me wonder, how do you see the role of the actors or the persons who move through these structures? I mean, since these relations are also shaped and reinforced through laws, institutions, and decisions made by people in powerful positions, how does that dimension fit into your reading?
Answer? Okay. I will start with the second question. When I understood correctly, it points to the point that production is the essential thing of capital. Exactly this view I was criticizing. I don't say that production plays no role, but to put it in such a center, to say this is the essential point, this, in my view, is wrong. For Marx, in Capital, and when we really have to read all three volumes of Capital, then we can understand it's always production and circulation. The first three chapters deal with circulation, with the exchange relation, the exchange process, the commodity circulation. In chapter 5, we can find on a very abstract level the first consideration of the production process as a labor process in the first half of the chapter and as a valorization process in the second half. And then the Marx deals also in the following chapters with production. In the second volume, the production process is presupposed and it's about the circulation process, and so on. So I don't see production as the center. I think we get a wrong picture of Marx analysis when we try to reduce either production or circulation or exchange. To say, oh, exchange is the center, it would be similarly wrong. It is always the outcome of the joint processes of production and circulation. And this I tried to make clear in my talk. At least this was one aim. The first question. You mentioned that in other texts, I said that Marx wanted to revise not only the manuscript of volume 3, this is for sure, but also, sorry, the already appeared volume 1. He did already changes to volume 1. The second edition has big changes compared with the first edition, and the French translation, which Marx reworked, also shows differences to the second edition. For an English translation, Marx wrote a list with possible changes. So he was changing a lot. However, a letter to Danielson, who was translating the first volume in Russian, indicates that he thought on fundamental changes. And what for me would be a candidate for such a more fundamental change is the chapter on the so-called primitive or better original accumulation. On the one hand, we have a changing view on this in Marx. In the 60s, Marx had more or less the view that there is a kind of necessity that the countries have to go this way to capitalism, which he described at the example of England. In the 70s, Marx learned more about Russia and also about the United States, and he learned that there is not only one way on the road to capitalism, and there is also not only one road when you want to exit capitalism. And he denied to say, oh, there's primitive accumulation, this is the typical road to capitalism. We also have excerpts from Marx in the 70s from a big historical work, Schlossers Weltgeschichte. Until now, these excerpts are published only in parts, but they show clearly that Marx was interested in the cities in Middle Ages, in Italian republics, and so on. When he wants to rework his chapter on primitive accumulation, then these excerpts would be very useful, at least this we can say. Regarding volume 2 and 3, I would say the questions about crisis, the questions about money circulation in volume 2, the credit system in volume 3 would be candidates for a massive reworking and changing capital. And then when I justify these judgments mainly with the letters of Marx. Then you also asked if there is some material for discussing the state in Marx. I would say yes, but it's rather complicated. We have from the early Marx some rather basic considerations of the state. He criticizes Hegel's philosophy of right, what was the most developed approach to state theory in these times. We have a lot of articles, newspaper articles, where he discussed questions of the state also theoretically. We have the 18th Brumaire, which is on the one hand a case study, but a case study which presents the material also in a more general framework. But all this Marx wrote before he really developed his critique of political economy. He showed a critical application already in the 40s of political economy, but not a critique of the categories of political economy. The only, or the biggest text we have from this period is Civil War in France, and in parts we also can say the critique of the Gotha program fits to this. So we have some material, but from very different periods, and the different periods are important because Marx had different levels of knowledge, of reflection. We cannot just combine all this and then we have the theory of state by Marx. We will not have this. We can use this material for ourselves. We can try to formulate some analysis of state, of state policy, and so on. But I think it would be a hunt for ghosts to say, oh, with this material, we can reconstruct Marx's theory of the state. No, this theory in the strict sense doesn't exist. Nevertheless, also in my biographical work, I must say, I found enormously interesting the many newspaper articles already in the early Rheinische Zeitung from 1842 until New York Daily Tribune in the 1850s, where, for example, Marx in a 10-part series of articles, he was analyzing the Spanish Revolution in early 19th century, discussing very detailed constitutions. So there is really an enormous material, and it's useful to dig in this material, but for our new studies, not for any reconstructions. And now the last question, the role of the actors. It's correct. You said I focus on structures, I focus on certain institutions, but what is with the role of actors, with decision making, and so on? Here I think we have, or what I do, I try to follow the logic of Marx Capital. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that Marx already in the preface mentions the persons appear here as personifications of economic interests and categories, is important for capital. However, it would be an error to say Marx always treated persons only as personifications. No, Marx is analyzing in Capital economic structures, and he comes to conclusions on persons from these structures. But this is not the whole story. The last chapter in volume 3 should be a chapter on classes. Unfortunately, this chapter stops after 1.5 pages. However, we can already learn something when we take into account that, for example, the Marx of the Communist Manifesto started with classes and class struggle as something which we can take for granted. Class struggle, class society, we have class societies, then we have class struggle. It appears in different historical forms, but we don't need to talk about class or class struggle in general. When Marx placed a chapter on class and class struggle at the end of volume 3, then this means that now he thinks, in order to talk about classes in a scientific way, we need all the material what is presented in the 3 volumes before. And after Capital, in the sequence of the books, should come a book on the state. So what we see at the end of volume 3, revenue and its sources, classes, is the transition to the analysis of the state, where again we have to do with structure, with institutions, but also with actions, with decisions. Insofar, I would say in Capital, Marx delivers a lot of material we need for the analysis of actors, of agency, of the possibilities of agency, but he doesn't deliver the theory of this agency. Some groups or traditions try to impose it in Capital. For example, the Italian school of operaismo, they want to, or they told us, crisis is a result of agency. Accumulation is a result of agency. I will not deny that agency plays a role for the concrete process of crisis and accumulation, but I would deny that it is just a result, that a crisis is an answer to the class struggle of the working class. We had economic crisis in capitalist countries with a lot of class struggle, but also with nearly no class struggle. So for crisis, we have a movement which works independently from class struggle. When we have class struggle, of course, it has an influence to crisis and accumulation, but on a second level, not in the first level. Insofar, you are right. Also in my publications about Capital, I don't talk very much about actors and agency, not because I think it is not an important issue, but I think in Marx Capital, the focus is on structures, and the discussion of agency follows.
Thank you very much. Very clear. I would like to finish with one more question about an issue you didn't mention in your talk, but is in the published article. So I was wondering if Marx wasn't really saying that everyone would end up totally poor, but that the gap between rich people and everyone else would keep getting bigger. How do we look at what's happening right now? I mean, it's hard to ignore that billionaires are popping up everywhere, and at the same time, you've got homeless camps growing in big cities, or people with full-time jobs sleep in their cars, and whole families depending on food banks just to get by. I mean, in a lot of places, I think even people who used to be considered middle class are drawing in debt or can't afford rent anymore. No, so doesn't all this make it look like Marx might actually have been pointed towards something like this? Maybe not totally poverty, not total poverty, but definitely the kind of deep or structural polarization we're seeing today, especially among the middle classes.
I understand. Okay, this is a very typical argument in Germany, which still is one of the richest countries in the world. And this means also what counts as poverty in Germany. In other countries, it wouldn't count as poverty. And here in this rich Germany, it is said, oh, this Marx, he did the but he did the anticipation that we have total misery in capitalism, but look around, it is not total misery. So his predictions are completely wrong, and when his predictions are wrong, then also the theory must be wrong. And here is, I argue on two levels. The first level is I look what did Marx really make as predictions. In Communist Manifesto, you have indeed a theory of absolute impoverization that Marx argues the modern capitalist is not even able, like the ancient slaveholder, to feed his slaves. They die by hunger. And indeed, in Communist Manifesto was published in 48, in 46, 47, we had in Western Europe the last starvation crisis that really people died by hunger. This was a little bit in the background of Marx, and he thought he can show capitalism leads to such an impoverization. 20 years later, in the first volume of Capital, Marx was much more cautious. He stressed the gap between the working class and the capitalist class. And he had a much broader notion of impoverization. He said, no matter what is the payment, the situation of the working class will become worse. On the one hand, all the stress of work, the insecurity of becoming unemployed or not, but this is not to reduce to a diminishing of the standard of living. What we see nowadays, I would say it is a mixture. Still in the developed countries, I wouldn't say in the developed capitalist countries, I wouldn't say you see an absolute miseration. Of course, real wages are sometimes smaller nowadays than they were 20 years before. It is not that the standards of living are increasing further and further. And especially in Germany, even middle-class families in big cities have the problem to find an apartment which they can pay, no matter if they want to rent or to buy the apartment. Especially here in Berlin, it is an enormously big problem. But still, I would say it is not this absolute impoverization Marx had in mind when he wrote Communist Manifesto. However, in parts of the world, especially in the global south, I think we can find examples for such an impoverization. And this is clearly a result of the capitalist world system. It is not just a result of climate, of bad harvest or so. Also, what I think what we will see in the next decades is a mixture of impoverization and climate crisis, that the climate crisis will destroy certain areas, will take away the basis for living for a lot of people. These people are forced to migrate, and they will fight with others. So I'm not very optimistic about the development of the capitalist system. Instead of one clear tendency, I would say you will see a mixture of relative impoverization, absolute impoverization, climate catastrophes which have effects, and what will be the outcome, I don't have a definite answer for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, and thank you also for this great discussion and for your conference. It was great having you here in the seminar, and thank you the people who attended the conference. And we invite you all to the next Friday. We have the second session of the conference, of the seminar. We will have Thomas Gurano. So thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.